Good evening, everybody. How are you? I want to welcome everybody to this Kaleidoscope event. Kaleidoscope is a series meant to foster openness, curiosity, and dialogue about issues and concerns in our community, our nation, and around the globe. So tonight is a perfect example of that. I'm Brianna Sittler. If you don't know me, I'm the Director of Special Programs, and the Kaleidoscope is one of my favorite programs to put on every semester. So thank you for coming. I want to let everybody know if you have a cell phone, please put it on silent or vibe. Tonight's event is made possible by People's Bank, the Kaleidoscope series, and the Life Lessons, the William and Marjorie Sadowski Center for Adult Learning at the JCC. So it's a combination effort tonight, bringing Mr. Milton here. I want to let you know tonight's discussion will challenge your preconceived ideas of what terrorism is, why it occurs, and what a terrorist might be. So this is an open discussion. It's not a lecture. Feel free to ask questions throughout the night. I'd like to introduce and welcome Robert Milton. He's a leading figure in national and international security with a distinguished career that spanned 4 decades. He's the retired commander of the London Metropolitan Police Service, New Scotland Yard, and during his career, he's played a leading role in the development and delivery of the national counter-terrorism strategies there. He's held many senior roles, including the National Coordinator of Ports Policing, Chair of the UK Border Agency Working Group, Security Commander of the Metropolitan Police, Head VIP of Protection, Director of the Intelligence International Terrorism, and Head of the UK National Terrorist Funding Unit. We know him from the time he was here as Margaret Thatcher's chief security and became close friends with Dr. Leary and Noel Leary. And he is now the managing director of Milton Tezelin Ltd, a company established in 2005 to deliver training and support to countries facing the threat of terrorism. And with this, help me welcome Bob Milton to the stage.
Thank you, Brianna. Well, thank you very much for turning up tonight. Some faces I've seen today already, so the fact you've come twice to see me I find is above and beyond the call of duty, so thank you for that, okay? From those from the community, I am really delighted to see you. I'm very much looking forward to discussing this issue with you, and I'd like you to be very open with me and ask me any questions you want, make any comments you want. Because as Brianna said, I'm not just going to stand up here and talk to you. That's not going to happen. Now, I should have started off by saying good evening, but for me, it's really good night, because I'm still on UK time. If I go quiet for more than a couple of minutes, could you just all file out very quietly and switch the light off, and I'll be fine, okay? All right? Terrorism is a very emotive subject, and I'm very, very aware that on April the 15th, you experienced something you should never experience, which is an unprovoked, outrageous attack in Boston, the Boston Marathon. And that, I'm sure, is still very uppermost in your minds. That's uppermost in your minds. And some of you may have some strong feelings about that, some rawness about that. And I understand that. During my career, I experienced a lot of terrorism, and I never really got over it. I've never really moved on for some of the things I've seen and experienced. Now, today we are going to discuss some sensitive issues, and I am going to challenge you a little bit about your conception of terrorism and terrorists. And you may think, hang on, where's he going on this? But bear with me and respond to me, ask me questions, especially when I ask you questions, come back at me, and we see where we'll go. I suspect that by the end of the session, which should be no more than an hour and a half, because I know the Red Sox are playing, okay, and I know Big Papa is just about to hit a home run around about 8:30, okay? So I'm going to try and finish no later than 9 o'clock, and I'm sorry about that. Some of you hope to get away a bit earlier. We'll see how we do, okay? If there is a home run, I'm reliably informed we're going to stop, show that, Get back onto terrorism again. Okay. So as I was saying, I think by the end of the session, the end of the hour and a half maximum, you may actually go away thinking, I don't know what I got out of that. I really don't understand where we've gone on this. I still have so many questions and very few answers. And if you do think that, then I'm really pleased because I've succeeded. Because that is exactly what this is all about. It's about us trying to think deeper about what is driving terrorism and how we're going to try and do something about it. Now let me just tell you a little bit about the history of this presentation, which I've adapted specifically for you, but it's a presentation that I have delivered around the world, particularly in Asia and Southeast Asia, where there is a very serious threat of terrorism. And I normally speak to police officers, military officers, security personnel. And some of these people, some of these organizations, and I'll be frank, have an appalling human rights record. Really bad. Do we engage with these people, or do we allow them just to operate without our influence? The UK Foreign Office has encouraged me to engage with them. And sometimes it's very difficult because of their human rights records. But the process that we go through when we start every course by discussing what is terrorism is to get them thinking beyond the black and white, to get them thinking beyond you just deal with terrorism by, quite frankly, going out and shooting terrorists. You actually think beyond it. You think about what your actions are and how they impact on the threat of terrorism, and more importantly, the radicalization of young men and women that turns them into terrorists. So that's the history of this, okay? It normally lasts, and you'll be pleased this is only going to last for an hour and a half, it normally lasts a day. It's that in depth, the time we spend with these people, okay? But as I say, today we're going to just spend just an hour and a half on this, okay? Please, as I say, I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to write some stuff on the board here. If you can't see what I've written on the board, don't worry about it. It's probably more for my benefit than you, okay? But I will take some of the information and I'll put it on the board for us to use again, okay? So the question is, are we up for this? Yep. Are you going to give it a best shot? Yeah? I've run out of gifts. I gave so many gifts away today. I've got no prizes for anybody, okay? But, we'll really have a go and we'll see if we can work our way through this very complex and difficult problem. So what we're going to try and do today is this. We're going to try and raise our understanding of terrorism, what it is, and what drives it. And that's what we're going to try and understand today. We're going to try and get to that point in an hour and a half. So let's start off by saying, well, what is terrorism? And I'm going to start off by some really simple things, looking at the history of terrorism. And the best bet for me, I looked at all the records, I've done my research. It seems there is a genuine agreement that this phrase terrorism was used during the French Revolution for the first time. And it was used by this particularly nice man called Robespierre. And it was used by the state to terrorize the population, to force them into complying with what the state wanted. I wonder if that rings any bells with certain regimes across the world that perhaps still this day use terrorism for the same purpose. Yeah? What about a dictionary definition of terrorism? It's always good to start, isn't it? Any student here, when you do your report, your essay, it's always good to start, isn't it? Well, what's the dictionary definition? So I looked it up, and there's a dictionary definition: an instant of cause or intense fear or anxiety. That's terror. Can I just say, can you read this okay on the screen? Yeah, because we've got to try and compromise between me appearing on TV, hello, and you being able to see the screen. If you're having difficulty, then we'll just drop the lights a bit, okay? And, I can remember when I first saw The Exorcist film, and it scared the living daylights out of me, actually, and it still scares me now. But that's terror. That's a dictionary definition of terror. Let's try an academic definition, and this is by a man I have a tremendous amount of respect for, a man called Lord Carlisle. And he reviewed the UK terrorism legislation. That was his job, and I worked very closely with him, and he's a very clever and astute man. And he said, terrorism is an anxiety-inspiring method of repeated violent action employed by semi-clandestine, because terrorism requires publicity. Without publicity, the terrorism isn't magnified to the extent that they wanted. It's done by an individual or group or state actors for idiosyncratic, criminal, political reasons, whereby, in contrast to assassinations, the direct target of violence are not the main targets. And that's a key feature of terrorism, isn't it? The targets, the victims of terrorism, are not the main targets. They're not the people they're trying to intimidate and influence. It's just innocent victims. And I did a presentation today on the July the 7th bombings in London, and 50-odd innocent people who just happened to get in the wrong train at the wrong time or the wrong bus lost their lives, and at least 500 other people severely injured. It's the terrorists like to attack unprovoked, indiscriminate targets to get to governments. That's a key issue of terrorism. What about this definition? Less scholarly? What about that definition? What looks, smells, and kills like a terrorist is terrorism. What do we think of that? Do you prefer that one to the other one?
No.
This is Sir Jeremy Greenstock, British ambassador to the United Nations at the time. I worked for a man called David Vaness, who became the UN head of security, and he said, if it looks like a duck and it talks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. In other words, I don't care what's behind it. If it's terrorism, it's terrorism. Now, I had a lot of respect for Jeremy Greenstock and Sir David Vaness. I'm not sure they're right, though. But they were responding to the threat. They had to put security in place. So perhaps they didn't have the luxury of spending too much time understanding what it was all about. So can you define terrorism for me? And this is where we're going to have a bit of audience participation. So who thinks they can have a go at defining terrorism? Anybody? We could stand and look at each other for 10 minutes until somebody says something. Come on, somebody. What do we think terrorism is? Yes, thank you. My saviour.
Somebody who just likes to scare other people.
Scare people.
He enjoys scaring you.
So you think it's scaring people, yeah? I'm going to write that on here. Scare. And it's people's the target, is it? Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? Yep.
Indiscriminate violence to attain a goal.
So it's indiscriminate and it's violence. So those two things are important. So violence. This is not a great pen. This is more for my benefit, so don't worry. Indiscriminate. And it's a goal. Now, what's this goal they're trying to attain? Yeah? Right, okay, that's good. They're trying to change something, aren't they? They want change. But they don't want to go through a democratic process, do they? No, that's missing here. They don't want to go through the ballot box. They don't want to spend time persuading people. They want to change. They want change because you don't agree with me, but I don't care. Yeah? So change. What sort of change do they want? What change do they want? Yeah. Yeah. What do they want their way, though? What do they want? What do most people, what do most terrorists want in the world? Power. Oh, God, this is good. Power. Whoa. Because power is really interesting, isn't it? Because power gives you what? Gives you the opportunity to really change things up, doesn't it? Yeah? Yeah? Control. What's another good one? So we're looking here sort of political change. Is that what we're looking for here? Yeah? Excellent. Okay. So it's this goal is, there's a political aspect to it. Is it just political or is there some other thing? Yeah.
Cultural.
Yeah, cultural. What else? Economic, yeah, I like that. What else? So somebody said something? I'll come to religious. Who said religious? Don't lose that point. Freedom. They want freedom for themselves, yeah? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Can I say freedom, self-determination, the ability to rule themselves? That's what you're talking about? Yeah?
Would also take away freedom from other people.
Yes, they can, yeah. That's the negative side. Who said religion? Yeah, these are hopeless. I've been sniffing them already. Who said religion? Religion's interesting, isn't it? Religion is controversial, okay? Religion has, the fact that we've included religion in our definition could upset a lot of people. This is no good either. This is terrorism. Okay, don't worry about this because I'm going to refer to this more than you. What else then? What else are the goals that we're looking for? What else do they want? What do we got? We've got economic change, political change, cultural, religion, we want freedom. What else? Poverty, did you say? Property. They want, that's an interesting one. Do they want property? Property? Let's put it down there. That's a good one. There's ideological change, isn't there? People have an ideology they want to force onto people. There's ideological change as well. Revenge is an interesting one, I tell you. Do you know, when I thought about I was going to do this, I wondered whether what you would say will be different to what my police officers say. And guess what? It is. It is. You are saying things much broader than what they say. And revenge is a really interesting one because if you speak to terrorists, they won't tell about revenge. They will say, no, we're not interested in revenge. Don't you believe it? Don't you believe it? What else? Yeah?
Personal gratification.
Okay. Do you think that's the case? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Personal gratification. So somebody else said enjoying it, didn't they, I think? So this is personal gratification. Okay. Now, can I just come over to this side of the board for a minute? We've talked about violence. What else is terrorism? Yeah.
One thing that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about these definitions is I'm trying to contrast what we think about as terrorism versus violence like what the mafia or drug cartels.
Yeah.
Is that also classified as terrorism?
That's what we're trying to work out here. So what are the mafia's goals, though?
I'm sorry?
What are the mafia, what do they want to achieve, the mafia?
It would be control over a specific region or
But ultimately, somebody said it over here. Who's power, money, greed, yeah. So that's the subtle difference, and we're going to come and look at that a little bit more detail, so that's a good point. Okay? But violence, what else is terrorism? Yeah.
Fear.
Yeah.
It's often, the result of terrorism is often fear, and the cause of terrorism is oftentimes fear.
Yeah, it is. Fear. In fact, it's the threat of violence that can be just as bad as the actual violence taking place, yeah? And it's the subsequent fear that is generated afterwards, and we'll talk more about that. What else? Yeah?
They want it to be something sensational that draws attention.
Yep. So when you say sensational, what you're basically saying is they want... Oh, God. Doesn't matter. Sensational, yeah? But what you're saying is publicity. Who said sensation? You're talking about publicity here, and we'll talk about that as well. That's brilliant. Yeah, publicity. Yes. Intimidation. That's a good word. That's all right. Don't worry about it. Intimidation's a good word as well. Intimidate. Who are they intimidating? Who are their targets for intimidation? The government. So when we look at the people, we're also looking at governments. Who else?
Whomever they feel they're at war with at the time?
Yeah, could be. Yeah. All right. We could spend the rest of the time doing this, and it is interesting, but I want to move on. And what we're starting to get here is a definition of terrorism, okay? We're starting to build a definition of terrorism, and it's clear from what you're saying that you think terrorism has two parts. It has obviously the violence, the intimidation, you know, that side of it. And when we talk about violence, we'll talk about violence against people. We'll talk about damage to property. That's all part of terrorism. I mean, there may be more we can talk about in a minute. And then we have all this bit over here. What are they trying to achieve? And it's power, it's political change, it's something to do with religion perhaps, it's an ideology. That's the whole part of it, okay? So what I want to do is have a look at some definitions, some legal definitions that are out there, and just see how we fit in, what you did fits in with them. So let's take, you know, I'm from the United Kingdom, let's take the United Kingdom. I'm not saying this is the best, I'm not saying any of these are any good, but let's have a look at them. The United Kingdom is in two parts. The first one is this bit. Terrorism means the use or threat of action designed to influence, intimidate, influence, we can say that. The government, yep. Intimidate the public, yep. Or section of the public, and made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. So what do we think about that definition? Does that sort of fit in with your ideas? Yeah? Yeah? This is the one that is upsetting so many people. The fact that we included in our Terrorism Act definition religion. Yeah.
When I were dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945,
yeah.
The act of terror, according to that definition.
What, were we at war then with Japan? Yes. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm not so glad you mentioned that, because the one thing I've taken out of this presentation to get it through on time was a long discussion about the difference between war and terrorism. Okay? And there is a difference. A war is a legal thing, and if we're at war with a country and we use weapon of mass destruction like that, I think it's beyond what we're talking about here today. But it's an interesting point. But supposing a country used a nuclear weapon against us, you know, if it was indiscriminate, if we didn't have a war with that country, it could well be an act of terrorism. So that's an interesting point. So we think that's fairly similar with our views of what we've said so far today. The second part is quite interesting because it actually says we're going to define the action in far more detail than what you have done. You've talked about violence. We talk about, serious violence to people, serious damage to property, you'd expect those on there. But then we go on about endangering a person's life. Doing something that endangers a person's life. Okay? What do you think? Why do you think we've included that in this act of terrorism? The definition of terrorism. Yeah, right at the back.
Because it might not necessarily actually hit a person or damage a property, but if it's something that could, and someone
Yep. That is not suicide bombing, actually, but it's interesting you should say that. It's more to do with the fact that we need to look at the future of terrorism, the type of weapons, the type of ways they're going to attack us in the future. And it could well be that they could use something that endangers people's lives that's not necessarily an act of violence, etc. Yeah? Cyber terrorism. You coming on Friday?
Actually, yes.
Well, the next one is interesting. We'll come to it. You'll see how good you were because you'll see in a minute. Okay. The next one is creates a serious risk to the health and safety of the public. Why have we included that? Yes, because we are really worried that a terrorist group is going to use some form of chemical or biological agent to attack us. Yeah.
Why wouldn't we consider that genetically modified foods?
Is that terrorism? You think so? For what cause? What's the... to feed us better?
Either to weaken us or to give pharmaceutical companies an upper hand so they can make more money off us in the future?
Possibly. Does that fit in, though, with our causes? Our political, religious, ideological, social? It might do, actually. It might do. Think about that. Yeah.
To bounce off of what he was saying, if it edits the way the food tastes or it causes us medical harm, you have not only the pharmaceutical companies but the people making the food. If it tastes better to us, then we're buying more, and that's power.
The way your minds think here is just absolutely fantastic. I tell you what. I hope you never become terrorists because they're just unbelievable. My God, they've got us. They've made a McDonald's taste good. We're in trouble. Oh, we're all going to get fat and die. Some of us are already fat. Okay, but that's really, I mean, smallpox, okay? Smallpox is terrible. If they get hold of smallpox, we're in trouble, you know, and there is certainly plans to try and get hold of smallpox. So we've got to think about, does our legislation, does our definition of terrorism cover that? What about the bottom one? Can you see that? It talks about designed to seriously interfere with or disrupt an electronic system. Larry, where's Larry? Yes! Cyber terrorism, as you said round here, we have included that in our legislation, specifically if you are going to interfere with an electronic system, cyber terrorism. And if you do come on Friday, I will talk about cyber terrorism. Okay, why have I gone off? Hang on, there we go. So that's the Terrorism Act in the UK. Let's have a look at some other ones. The European Union, that wonderful group of people who sit down and speak harmoniously together and agree everything. Just as good as your government. That's terror. Who said that? Oh, that's it. Let's go. We've got it now. That's terrorism. So, the EU couldn't agree anything, okay? They are hopeless. So they came up with a framework, all right? They haven't actually got a definition. They've got a framework for coming to a definition. And what is interesting is, whereas the UK definition specifically mentions religion and political, and ideological, this doesn't. This has removed that completely. And simply says intimidation. See, we got that word because we're good. Compelling a government, etc., etc. Yeah. Seriously destabilizing, destroying the fundamental political, constitutional, economic, or social. So they're saying it's destroying the political, constitutional, economic, social framework, foundations of a country through terrorism. But it specifically ignores this. It doesn't talk about motives. Then we have the US Code. I had to include you in this, okay? The US Code, again, involves acts dangerous to human life that violate laws. Yep.
Is any of this totally irrational? I mean, it just happened, people are just doing it. It says here without a motive.
That's one of the problems. If you try and have a definition without having a clear motive, it's a cop-out. And there's a reason there's a cop-out, is because they don't want to put in their legislation the fact it's a political, religious, or social thing. They don't want to include that. They want to give themselves some freedom, some movement. Okay? I'm not saying we're right in the UK. I'm saying there's problems with that. But a lot of these other definitions are trying to be far more free. They don't want to tie themselves down to those specific things. And there's another reason for it. It's a really good question. There's another reason for it, is that it's very difficult to get international agreement if you do put these specific motives down. Very difficult. And we'll come on to that in a minute. So we've got intimidate and coerce again. Influence the policy of a government. Use weapons of mass destruction, assassination, kidnapping. Okay? I'm rushing through this because I want to get on to the more interesting bits in a minute. Okay? The League of Arab States. Why are you laughing? Well, who's laughing? Come on. The League of Arab States. They say this. Any act or threat of violence, whatever its motives. They've completely ruled out. We don't have to be political, it's just whatever the motives. Okay? Panic among people, causing fear, harming them, and so on and so on and so on. That was done in 1998. That was their agreement in 1998. So that's an even wider definition of terrorism. But, there's a but. It's not terrorism if it's a struggle against foreign occupation. Ooh, that's interesting, isn't it? That's interesting. So, who is occupying Palestine according to... So therefore, that's not terrorism. That's not terrorism according to the League of Arab States because it's an occupying force. Okay. The UN definition of terrorism. Now we're really getting somewhere. The UN, that wonderful organization, yeah? You'll notice it says draft treaty. They've only been talking about this for about 30 or 40 years, and they've got a draft treaty now. Basically, they have not got a definition of terrorism because they cannot get everybody to agree it. So they haven't got a definition of terrorism. And the reason they haven't, and the problems because they haven't got it, is this. Without an international definition of terrorism, it's impossible really to get good international cooperation. It is damaging the UN's attempt to get international cooperation because we cannot get every country to agree a definition of terrorism. Yeah?
Does the Security Council have one?
No, because it's the UN has to have it. The Security Council, you've got to be careful with the Security Council because it doesn't represent the whole of the UN, and you need the whole of the UN to be behind this because some of the areas you want cooperation are in countries which are not in the Security Council. Okay? Why am I going on? Why is it so necessary to have an internationally agreed definition? Yep, anybody? Let's have a look. If you don't have an internationally agreed definition of terrorism, it can seriously undermine human rights. And what I mean by that is if you have a country that considers opposition to a regime as being terrorism, then how can we deal with that country? Peaceful opposition to a regime is not terrorism. But some countries it is. It jeopardizes the political order. It undermines democracy because we cannot have this agreed understanding of what we mean by terrorism. It threatens international peace and security. It's that important. There are some pragmatic reasons as well. You can't have global and regional cooperation if you don't have this shared understanding. I can only teach counter-terrorism to countries that have at least a shared understanding of terrorism with the UK. I can't go to other countries. There has to be trust and common values. Again, if you have a shared understanding of terrorism, you can have that. Common priorities, legal systems, extradition, intelligence. One of the key weapons in our managing the threat of terrorism is the ability to exchange intelligence between countries. I'm not going to exchange intelligence with a country that's going to use that intelligence to, as I said, attack some peaceful opposition group. That's not going to happen. So unless we have this shared understanding of terrorism, I can't share intelligence with them. It doesn't work. And human rights again, and the rule of law. Rule of law, very important in terrorism. Okay. So, let me ask you another question. Are terrorists criminals?
Yes.
Who says, is anybody here going to say no? Let's get that person out straight away. Yes. Why? Say again. That's a good one. Yeah?
I think it depends on the situation. Because if you have an oppressive government and you have a group that is oppressed and have no options other than to engage in the terrorist activity to overcome that oppression, you know, they would be defined as a criminal by the group in power.
Okay. Okay. Who was the greatest British Prime Minister? Dr. Leary. Dr. Leary. Who is the greatest British Prime Minister that you've met and had tea with?
I know it, but that's debatable, Bob.
We know that Lady Thatcher was the greatest British Prime Minister. We all know that. And she said, "A crime is a crime is a crime." That's what she said. I should qualify when she said that. She said that during the hunger strikes of the Provisional IRA in the 1980s, when 10 Provisional IRA terrorists who were properly arrested and put into prison went on hunger strike and died, one after another. And she was refusing to give them political status in the prisons. That's why she said, a crime is a crime is a crime. Just think for a minute about that. Whether she's right or wrong, just think about someone starving themselves to death. Not going out and blowing themselves up and killing people, but in their cell, in Long Kesh prison camp in Northern Ireland, starving themselves to death. Does that sound like a criminal?
No.
Difficult then, isn't it? Even though that person may well have committed acts of terrorism, and the famous leader was Bobby Sands, and Bobby Sands did carry out some shootings, and he was properly convicted for that. But he was elected to Parliament for West Belfast whilst he was in the prison camp. So it's not quite as simple saying, are they criminals? We'd like to say they're criminals because they carry out terrible acts of violence, which is a crime. But are they criminals? Should we treat them as criminals? And one way of thinking about it is to actually say, let's compare their motives. And we started this just now when we talked about the mafia. What is the motive of a terrorist? It's certainly not, I don't think it's to do with greed and money and self-advancement. I don't think that's the motive of a terrorist. I think that's the motive of a criminal. I think criminals do things for criminals. They may want power, but ultimately they want money, and it's to do with greed. I don't think terrorists do that. I don't think Bobby Sands gained much from starving himself to death. So the terrorist motive is normally quite altruistic for his people, for his cause. And then we can go through everything else. What is the success criteria for a terrorist? And for Al-Qaeda, success is large parts of the world with a total political change. A caliphate, an Islamic state across large parts of the world with no Western influence. When do you think they want to achieve that? Next year? The year after? 5 years' time? No. No. They'd like, yeah. Their ambition is, and their reality is, this isn't going to happen in the next 10 years, 20 years. They're in this 30, 40, 50 years. Criminals, they want it now. They want the money now. And I'm not going to go through every part of this, but we can look at all these different areas of criminal activity and terrorist activity, and we can compare and contrast. But I'm going to tell you a story that really brings it home. I tried to recruit a Provisional IRA senior officer as an informant. And I offered him a sum of money to work for me. How much do you think I offered him? Any ideas? What scale of money am I going to offer this guy? Yes, absolutely. Suitcase full of £1 million. And I placed it in front of him. Did he take it? No. And yet I promised him security, a change of identity, because I knew the information he had is so vital to us, it would be well worth £1 million. He used a very bad language to tell me where to go. So there's a guy that has turned down a huge amount of money because he believed, rightly or wrongly, I'm not trying to excuse what he did, but he believed in a cause. So when we talk about our terrorist criminals, yeah, they're criminals in the sense that they're carrying out criminal acts. Let's face it, murdering people, injuring people, damaging property can be nothing other than a criminal act. But we need to understand more about their motives if we're going to deal with them. A criminal informant will work for you for money, no doubt about it. Not always, but a lot of them will. You're not going to get a terrorist informant to work for you for money. You're going to have to think of something else. Yeah?
Well, what about when they recruit the children to do suicide bombing? These children do not know what they are doing.
Yeah?
So how do you explain that?
Sorry, I'm not. What is your point there? So the children are not terrorists because they don't know what they're doing. Yeah.
They are
The
not.
terrorists are the people that get the children to do that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do you explain that?
I can't explain it. I cannot explain why somebody would ask a child to become a suicide terrorist. I can't even explain why somebody would become a suicide terrorist themselves. It's an impossible, question to answer. Interesting question,
This is
but it's
the
impossible.
This is the ultimate of terrorism
Yeah.
in my book.
Well, we're going to have a look at some suicide terrorist cases in a minute and see if we come back to you to see what you think. Yeah, you first.
Where does torture fit into this calculus?
Torture by who? Guantanamo Bay torture or torture?
Whoever.
Torture would fit into terrorism if torture was a terrorist group torturing somebody for those political aims or religious aims. That's terrorism, isn't it? That's violence towards a person. That's serious violence to a person. okay? The argument is a state sanctioning torture. Is that terrorism? And that's a different kettle of fish altogether, isn't it? Yeah? Yeah.
But a phrase that we often hear being used as a terrorist could be someone else's freedom fighter.
Yeah, and when we were going to talk about war, which I've taken off the agenda because I want to see Big Papa hit his home run, we would have spoken about that quite at length, because actually freedom fighters, guerrilla warfare, people fighting for their homeland, an insurgency, all these areas are different levels of, you know, is it one extreme, it's war, declared war in another country, and then you've got all these different sort of grey areas, haven't you? Is it terrorism? I suspect a lot of it is the terrorism as a tactic used by these people. So if you're engaged in a counterinsurgency, people are trying to get into your border, take over your country, it may well be a military action. You may be fighting a military action, but they may also use acts of terrorism against you as well. So terrorism then becomes a tactic to be used rather than a thing. Yeah? Okay. What about protest? Some countries, it's terrorism if you stand up and protest against the government. And I know this because I was in Vietnam, and I love Vietnam, I think it's a lovely country, and they sat down and gave me a list of a dozen organizations which they said were terrorists. And every one of them was simply opposition groups. There was no suspicion of violence or using explosives. No, they're against the government. They're terrorists. Is this terrorism? Burning a flag? No. Oh, this is good. Who said yes? Why?
No patriot, sorry. I think it's a...
Depends whose flag it is? Depends whose flag?
Yeah. I'm honest.
If it's the US flag, it's terrorism. If it's the Danish flag,
I mean, it could lead to terrorism. That's what I meant to say.
it may lead to it, and certainly there were people killed during this particular demonstration here. People were killed. This flag, the Danish flag, was burnt because a cartoonist in Denmark depicted Allah in a certain way, and certain extremists within the Muslim communities, small minority, objected to it, and they ended up with that. What about this? Here you go. What about this guy here? He's got a big brick, and there's some poor police officer about to collect this brick on his head. Is that terrorism? Yes. Okay. Well, is it protest? Well, is it for political? Is the cause political? Yes. He is protesting against the G20. Is it violence? Yes. Is it serious violence? Yes. It is if you're that police officer, isn't it? Yeah. What about this guy?
No.
Peace man. Used to be like me at university when I had long hair. You know, that's me. That was me. Peace. Okay. What about this? I hope this is going to play. There you go. Do you remember this, everybody? Yeah. Tiananmen Square. Yeah. Let me ask the question first. Is he a terrorist?
No.
Well, the Chinese thought he was a terrorist. Or are these terrorists?
Yes.
No. I just love this because this guy's got his shopping here. This is not weapons. This is his weekend shop, you know. And then he climbs on the tank. I think it's unbelievable. Look. So, is he a terrorist? Okay. I'm so pleased that we mentioned power before, because what I want to ask you there is, looking at that picture, and that picture went across the world, and that video, where does the power lie in that picture? Where do you think? Yeah? You think he had the power? That one man had the power. Yeah? Anybody else? You see, I think you're right. And you're the only person I've ever come across who's actually said that. Normally all my police officers says, oh, it's the tanks that got the power. But no. And that one image went across the world, was in all the newspapers, that video was on all the TV channels, and we got some political change in China. It was gradual, but because of that, we got political change. So power probably lied with him. Do you know what happened to him?
Yeah, I just whisked away and you've never seen him.
That's exactly right. I thought he was killed, but he didn't. He just disappeared, and hopefully he's still alive today, because he's one of my heroes, I have to say. Okay? Okay, what drives a person to commit murder and sacrifice themselves for a cause? This is coming back to your thinking about the kids and people that do that, okay? Can't hear that, can you?
We love death the way you love life. I tell all you British citizens to stop your support to your lying British government and to the so-called war on terror. And ask yourselves, why would thousands of men be ready to give their lives for the cause of Muslims? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Nisa says, and what is wrong with you, that you fight not in the cause of Allah, and for those weak, ill, treated, oppressed among men, women and children, whose cries our Lord, rescue us from this town whose people are oppressors, and raise for us from among you one who will protect, and raise for us from you one who will help.
لذلك جاء شهزاد لقواعد جماعة قاعدة الجهاد وبقي فترة مع محمد صديق وكان كلاهما.
Okay. The man you saw first of all is Mohammed Sadiq Khan, leader of the July bombings, July 2005 bombings. The other man you saw was al-Zawahiri, who is very high up in Al-Qaeda. There he is, Mohammed Sadiq Khan. Schoolroom assistant, classroom assistant, looking after kids, young kids. He was the leader, son of a Pakistani immigrant who had taken British citizen. What I find chilling about that video that you may not pick up is that he's speaking in a Northern English accent. This is not someone who's come in from overseas. This is somebody who has been brought up in England, and he speaks with an English Northern England accent. Married, father of one. Quiet, studious, never really in trouble. Highly regarded, westernized. Insisted on being called Sid rather than Sadiq. This is the guy that went to Pakistan, volunteered to be a terrorist, was trained in Pakistan, was told how to make explosives, came back to the UK, made those explosives, and with 3 other people killed 50 plus on the underground and bus in London. What happened to him? Something happened to him. And if you look at his patterns of behavior over the year before the terrorist act took place, you could see him being slowly radicalized by extremists within the local community, to an extent that in the end he was in such a state he went to Pakistan and they finished it off in Pakistan. And they preached hatred of the West, hatred for the UK, hatred for what we were doing in Iraq, and turned him in to a terrorist.
will be our targets.
This is
Until
his
you stop
colleague,
the bombing,
Tanweer.
gassing, imprisonment and torture of my people, we will not stop this fight. We are at war and I'm a soldier. Now you too will taste the reality of this situation.
Your democratic elected governments perpetuate atrocities against my people. So he's saying, I'm going to attack you because you're electing your government and they've invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and they're carrying out atrocities against us. That's what he thinks. Wafa Idris. Wafa Idris worked for the Red Crescent organization in Palestine. She looked after the refugees. She was about 30, was married, but her husband left her. And one day she saw an Israeli tank shell kill her friend. 2 months later, she became the first female suicide terrorist when she went into Jerusalem, into a cafe, blew herself up, killed one man, and injured many others. Sri Lanka. You all know about Sri Lanka, the fight of the Tamil Tigers. We talked about self-determination and freedoms. They wanted self-determination in Tamil Nadu. A lady called Danu killed Ravi Gandhi with an explosives underneath her sari, blew herself up, killed another other people, plus Rajiv Gandhi. Why did she do that? What drove her to do that? Well, the previous year, when the Indian Army was in Sri Lanka, she was captured by the Indian Army, she was repeatedly raped, and she volunteered to take revenge on the Indian Army and its leaders. So when we start thinking about what drives people to be terrorists, what we see time and time again is motives that are way beyond simply political gain, religious gain, ideological gain. There's something else driving them. People like him, Abu Hamza, currently in America, waiting trial. A vicious, nasty man who preaches hatred against the UK, hatred against the West, hatred against America. I've listened to him. He stands up and says, go out and kill people, poison them, stab them. And he's a cleric. And he was working from a mosque in London until we stopped him and put him in prison. And now he's waiting trial in America. These are the sort of people that are driving terrorism. And then we get someone like this, Nazir Abbas. Nazir Abbas was a terrorist from Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia. He used to run a training camp in Afghanistan-Pakistan border. He is my friend. Does that shock you? Because when he was captured about 5 or 6 years ago by the Indonesians, a very clever and a very astute general interrogated him, and he turned him around. And Nazir Abbas now works for me on some of my training courses. He will tell you that he still harbors the belief that there should be an Islamic caliphate across Indonesia and Southeast Asia. But what he'll say now is that violence isn't the answer to it. He's still radicalized. He's still a radical man. He still wants that. But he doesn't want violence. And he's now helping us deal with the threat of terrorism in Indonesia. So, we come to the big question. Is terrorism ever justified? Let's just recap. Remember, what if Idris? She saw somebody close to her being obliterated by an army tank. Danu, who was raped by the Indian army, wanted revenge. Is terrorism ever justified? What do you think? Is it justified then?
Who makes that decision? Depends upon the circumstances.
Who is the greatest terrorist in the world? Who said? Somebody said. Did somebody say president? Somebody. Who's the greatest terrorist in the world? Who do you think? The most famous terrorist in the world? Stalin. Could well be right. Osama bin Laden. Hitler. Oh, yeah, you could be right there. Definitely, you could be right there. Well, I think the guy that wrote that is the greatest terrorist in the world. Any idea who it is? This is taken from his book. He wrote a book. It's no good telling me now you were going to say that. You'd have been really clever if you'd have said it beforehand.
I did say it.
Did she say that?
Yeah.
All right.
Can you go back? Can you go back to that slide? So we can read it. Thank you.
I spoke to Nelson Mandela when he came to the UK. I was on protection, and I had a wonderful 30-second conversation with him. That's enough when you're talking to Nelson Mandela. Wonderful man, okay? Wonderful man. He went on to say this. This is from an interview with Larry King, one of your famous TV interviewers, yeah? I was a terrorist yesterday. I tell them that I was also a terrorist yesterday, but today I am admired by the very people who said I was one. Don't underestimate Nelson Mandela. He was the leader of the Black Panthers. He was a terrorist. By every definition that we came up with, he was a terrorist. Is terrorism ever justified? Just now you were very strong, saying nope, but now perhaps not so sure. He was fighting a regime that was violent, was prejudiced. Was he right to turn to violence? Who said no?
Well, if it worked for the good of mankind, there could have been some justification for it.
So you think there could be justification? Well, that's the problem, isn't it? You know, it's again, it's where do you stand on this, you know? Tell it to the people that died because of something he did. Yeah?
If you carry out terrorism against those that are harming you, perhaps it could be justified. If you carry out terrorism, as one of the definitions, against innocent people to influence you can't get to the one that's hitting you, so you hit the
Trouble with that is, it's that phrase, they're harming us. There are certain people in the world honestly believe the UK and the US are harming their people. They have that held belief in Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world. They honestly believe that.
Would what Nelson Mandela went through, would that be considered war rather than terrorism? Because you said acts of war and terrorism. They were, South America was generally basically.
For it to be an act of war, you've got to have a declared act of war. Is it a guerrilla fight, or is it, you can use all these phrases to try and excuse it. But at the end of the day, he was a terrorist because he went out clandestinely and indiscriminately carried out acts of terrorism. He admits it. Yeah. You're all trying to desperately excuse him some way. That's okay. Terrorism is everything apart from Nelson Mandela because he's such a nice guy, you know? Yeah.
I understand why he did what he did. However, I mean, terrorism is terrorism. Nelson Mandela also spent 25 years?
Long time in prison. Yeah.
A long time in prison for his actions. And he came out a changed man, or a better man, I should say. I don't know him, so I can't say he came out changed. But he came out a better man, and he ended up helping his people, and more people than his people. So I can understand why he would want to do what he planned. I do not support terrorism at all.
Okay. Somebody else? Yeah.
What about eco-terrorism? Like what people would label some of the acts of Greenpeace, or in the West, we have people that are labeled eco-terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, when you start looking at those other areas, I mean, if they damage large crops, large fields of crops, our friend here was talking about this, is that terrorism? You know, serious damage to property for a political reason? Could well be argued to be terrorism by some countries. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have the violence that we associate with it, do it? It's the same with cyber terrorism. I've had long discussions with people saying, no, that's not terrorism, there's no violence. Well, there could well be violence if they've just shut down a nuclear power station or an air traffic control system. Yeah, you want to say something? Yeah, yeah. Hang on, I'll come back. Yep.
Sorry, I don't know too much about Nelson Mandela.
Yep.
That he survived prison, and if that was his path to take to be a terrorist, and he's proud of it, people embrace him. That's good. Yeah, you know, I guess, you know, everyone can change. But I see men who have done, and women who have done great things for the world, like Gandhi. And Martin Luther King, look at the situation in Texas and that period of time. These are men who stressed nonviolence and got good results. Unfortunately, they gave their lives.
Yeah, and I think you put that very, very well, that actually, do you always have to resort to violence? There are other ways, perhaps. Did Nelson Mandela have to resort to violence? Gandhi didn't. So perhaps when you think about it, at the time he was doing it, he was a terrorist. Yeah?
With like the founding of our country, the colonials could very well be described as terrorists. And the Indians didn't do anything, or the Native Americans didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And 97% of their population was wiped
I
out.
know, that's terrible, isn't it? Yeah.
So in that case, if they were able to produce terrorism, they probably should have.
Yeah.
To protect themselves. So I think that there is negotiation.
So if the native population used violence, used terrorism to repel what was happening to them, to defend themselves about what, you would think that would be justified, yeah? Given the scale of what was happening to them, yeah?
I mean, it was terrorism.
Okay. Okay. You see, people resort to terrorism because they find themselves in a hopeless situation a lot of the time, because they can't see any other way of getting out of it. I mean, a lot of Palestinians feel that way. I'm not saying it's justified at all, but they feel that they are completely overwhelmed by the situation, that they have no real friends in the world, that everybody seems to be behind the Israelis. And the result is that the only way they can fight back, the only way they can get recognition for their problems is to carry out acts of violence. Now, I don't agree with that. Don't think I'm agreeing with that. I'm just explaining that is the problem. That people, when you push people into a situation, sometimes they will respond, or the only way they think how. Yeah.
Don't you think of terrorism as being more of an organized group? In other words, it's not an individual who's backed in a corner.
Not anymore, I don't.
So you don't, okay.
Not, I'll tell you why I don't.
Most terrorists are connected or
No.
think they're connected with...
I think one of the biggest worries we have at the moment, and it comes back to cybersecurity and everything else and the use of the internet, is people being radicalized, self-radicalized, and actually carrying out acts of terrorism almost on their own. Look what happened in Norway. Yeah. Look what happened in Norway. That is an outrageous act of terrorism. Guy was self-radicalized. He spent a lot of time on the internet. So I don't think that's the case. That's a really interesting point, because I think in the past, I think you could say big terrorist organizations.
Do you think he's a terrorist, or do you just think he's a murderer? A crazy, misguided murderer? He wasn't part of an organization.
I think he's a terrorist because I think he was doing it for a political reason. He was doing it for an ideology. That makes him a terrorist. Doesn't stop him being a murderer, because he is, yeah.
I'm only thinking there are some people who enjoy killing other people, who enjoy killing.
There are certain, you're right, there are within any organization those people who are,
To torture
yeah,
other people,
yeah,
and they enjoy it.
you're right.
So when they ask them during the trial, they love it.
But that's not my understanding. I've interviewed a lot of terrorists, and very few of them, I would say, fit into that category. Most of them, and this is quite sad, are intelligent people who actually very carefully figure out what they're going to do and why they're going to do it, and don't want to do it, actually. So they don't fit into your category. They're very cool and calculating about what they're doing. Look, I need to get on. But go on, I'll take you. Go on. Yep.
It seems like one of a common thread that goes through all of this is, at least for most terrorists, is that they feel they have been wronged.
Yeah.
They've been wronged.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela and so forth. So my question to you is, in your opinion, would there be less terrorism in the world today if, for example, the UN did not create Israel in 1948 out of the British protectorate in Palestine, if we did not invade Iraq, if we did not go into Afghanistan and so forth? Would there be less terrorism?
Well, what you say is interesting, because a lot of terrorism is driven by what is perceived to be foreign occupation of somebody's land. But that becomes incredibly complex, because if you take Northern Ireland, for example, that was all about the UK's alleged foreign occupation of Northern Ireland. It may well be we were there. But does that ever justify some outrageous acts of violence, indiscriminate violence against people? Or is there a better, our lady friend up there, is there a better way of getting your point across rather than killing people? That's the issue, you know? Yeah.
They seem to be killing more of their own than they are.
Yeah, but they don't mind that.
Yeah, but
You see, that's the issue with terrorists.
I don't understand why they would. The target seems to be their own people.
Yeah, the target isn't their own people. The target is governments. They just kill their own people and other people indiscriminately because they know they can intimidate governments by doing that. They can put pressure on governments. Okay? I do want to move on, because look at the time. Now, can you ever negotiate with terrorists? No? Okay. See this gentleman here? His name is Martin McGuinness. This man here is Tony Blair, one of our prime ministers. This one is a Protestant leader of Northern Ireland, and this is the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Southern Ireland. Okay, nice happy photograph. There he is, same man. That is Martin McGuinness. And he is, when that was taken, the deputy president of the Provisional IRA. He was a terrorist. A man suspected, with very good intelligence, of carrying out horrendous acts of terrorism. There he is. There he is. There he is. And what's interesting about that photograph is my respect for the Queen. This man here led an organisation that killed her cousin, Lord Mountbatten. And is that a smile or is that a grimace? He's a minister. Martin McGuinness is a minister of Northern Ireland. He's the minister for education. He's looking after the sons and daughters of the police officers who live in Northern Ireland. Can you negotiate with terrorists? Well, we did. We did in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement. Let's finish off with this slide. Because if you're not careful, you start thinking that terrorism is okay, and it's not. Okay? Terrorism is not okay. Terrorism is criminal. It's unjustifiable regardless of any justification. You've got to hold to that. You've got to be clear about that. And the UN Security Council, not the whole of the UN, said that. And that's what I hold dear. That's when I start getting confused about it, I come back to this. Yeah?
And I agree with that, and I almost, by looking at that, I'll look at everything you have written on the right side of the board, and they have a goal, and then do they still have that goal, and no matter what they're doing, are they going to continue to attempt to attain that goal?
Unless we do something about it. So I'm going to finish by getting back to the IRA again. Why do you think the Provisional IRA started negotiating with the British government? I'll tell you. Because the police, the intelligence services, the military had all but defeated them. We had got them in such a situation that we had penetrated them, we knew what they were doing, they were starting to become ineffective. And very cleverly they realized that their only solution was to negotiate. So we dragged them kicking and screaming to the negotiating table and held them down while they negotiated with our politicians. Sadly, a faction of the IRA broke away, and we have the real IRA now that's still carrying out acts of terrorism because they still want a united Ireland. But the Provisional IRA laid down their arms, and their leaders have now become politicians in Northern Ireland. And we've had to swallow that. Police officers, prison officers in Northern Ireland who've lost their lives, lost families, lost people, colleagues to the terrorist campaign, have had to swallow it. They've had to accept it because there is peace, a level of peace in Northern Ireland that didn't exist before. There is a negotiated way out of it. We've got a few more minutes, and I just want to wrap it up by saying this. When you look at the threat of terrorism, when you try to assess the threat of terrorism, you have to look at three things. You have to look at their intention, their capability, and when they're going to attack you. We can do a lot to reduce their capability. We can stop them crossing borders, for instance, by having really good border control. We can arrest their people, their leaders. We can stop them getting hold of arms and explosives. We can cut off their supply of money. We can do lots and lots of things that make it really hard for them to operate. We can reduce their capability. And we are successful at doing that. Your country is successful at doing that. We can make it a hostile environment for them. We can be good at cybersecurity, Larry. Yeah? So they can't get through. We can do all that. But if we don't deal with the intention as well, if we don't work on what's driving the terrorism, we will never get a lasting solution to it. Because no matter how good we are, they will still try and get to us. And they will be successful. 1984, the IRA tried to kill Margaret Thatcher, and they came within a few yards of doing it. Just lucky that she was still writing her speech at 3 a.m. in the morning rather than going to bed. And when the bomb went off at the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984, and I was there, she survived. Not everybody did. There were people killed. The IRA said, we were unlucky today, but you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once. But do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Nah, rubbish. Rubbish. Sorry. I agree with Gary Player. I'm a very bad golfer, but I agree with Gary Player. Gary Player said, the harder we practice, the harder I practice, the luckier I become. Who's the golfers here? Who are golfers here? You know that's true. It's always the good players that are the lucky ones. Us hackers, we end up in the water. The good players, it always just hovers on the edge, doesn't it? Now, the reason I say that is this, that we need to be lucky, and we need to be lucky by working hard. And we've got to work hard not only on dealing with the capability. We've got to do that. We've got to have security. You can't negotiate with somebody who's holding a gun to your head. You can't do that. So we've got to have all that. But our ultimate goal is that we've got to drag them to the negotiating table. We've got to think about the underlying causes of terrorism. And that means we've got to think about terrorists in a new way. Yes, they commit acts of criminality. Yes, it is totally unjustifiable. But we've got to do more than just simply deal with the capability. We've got to put as much energy and money into trying to deal with the underlying cause, because that's the only solution to terrorism. That's the only way we're going to defeat terrorism. We're never going to defeat them by locking them all up. It's not going to work. Who said revenge? Somebody said revenge earlier on, doesn't it? I want to come back to that, because revenge is a big part of terrorism, and that's happening a lot in Southeast Asia now. There's a lot of attacks taking place against revenge because we keep locking them up, and they're now attacking the police officers specifically for that. So we've got to deal with this. We've got to deal with these underlying causes. That's the solution to terrorism. And it's not easy. Trust me, it is not easy. It's a very hard thing to do, okay? I said to you at the beginning of this that you probably have far more questions after this than you have answers. That you may have come in here with a very clear understanding of what you think to be terrorism, and you may go out thinking, I'm not so sure. If some of you have that now, then I'm very happy, because that's what I want you to have. I want you, and I want everybody to think, you know what? We need to get to grips with the causes of terrorism. We need to put far more energy into that. We can't simply protect ourselves. We've got to do more. Yeah? So it's 9 o'clock, and Big Poppy's just about to hit another home run, so I'm not going to delay you anymore. Can I just say there has been some fantastic comments from everybody, some really interesting things. I'm sorry we didn't have longer to really go into detail on some of the areas. I am around for the rest of the week. Please come and speak to me if you think you want to, explore these issues more. You've been a great audience. You've responded to my questions. Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and as usual, I've ended up learning quite a bit as well from you, okay? If you've just gone away thinking, not so sure, there's more to this. Okay? So thank you very much, and I wish you a good night. Good.